The air was cool and damp, carrying the faint scent of earth and stone. Turin stood at the mouth of the great cavern, his shadow stretching long across the threshold. He had heard the stories, whispered in the dark corners of distant lands, tales of a hidden stronghold carved into the bones of the earth, a sanctuary for elves who wished to remain unseen. Yet no words had prepared him for the sight before him. The cavern opened into a vast underground world bathed in the golden glow of enchanted lanterns. The light danced across the high, arched ceilings, where delicate carvings of trees and stars seemed to grow from the stone itself. A river ran through the heart of this place, its waters glittering like liquid silver, and the sound of its flow was a soft, unbroken melody that filled the air. Bridges of white stone arched gracefully over the water, connecting pathways that twisted and turned like the branches of an ancient tree. Turin's boots echoed softly as he took his first steps into the city. Elves watched him from the shadows, their eyes bright and keen, their movements graceful and deliberate. There was no mistaking the wariness in their gazes. Turin was no elf, and though he bore the strength and resolve of a warrior, he was still an outsider. He felt the weight of their judgment pressing against him, but he held his head high. The scars on his hands and the sword at his side spoke of battles fought and blood spilled, and he carried himself with the quiet assurance of a man who had faced death and survived. A tall elf, clad in armor that gleamed like moonlight, stepped forward to greet him. "You are Turin, son of Hurin," the elf said, his voice calm but firm. "The tales of your deeds have reached even here." Turin inclined his head, his gaze steady. "I am," he said simply, "and I have come to offer my blade." The elf studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a slight nod, he motioned for Turin to follow. As they walked, Turin took in the intricate beauty of the city. The halls were vast and open, yet they felt intimate, as though every stone had been placed with care. The air was filled with a quiet hum, a song that seemed to come from the very walls. Warriors moved with purpose, their weapons gleaming, their eyes sharp. This was not a place of idle peace. Nargothrond was a fortress, and its people were prepared for war. They came to a grand hall, its walls adorned with tapestries that told the stories of ages past. Turin's eyes lingered on one depicting a great dragon, its body coiled in flames, its eyes fierce and unforgiving. He felt a chill run down his spine. Glaurung. The name was a curse, a shadow that hung over the land. He clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. He had not come here to hide from the dragon's wrath. He had come to face it. The elf leading him, Orodreth, the lord of this place, turned to face him. "You are bold to come here, Turin," he said. "Many would not risk the journey. Yet boldness alone does not earn trust." Turin met his gaze, unflinching. "I asked for no trust. I ask only for a chance to fight." A flicker of something, curiosity, perhaps, passed over Orodreth's face. He gestured to the gathered warriors, who watched the exchange in silence. "These are the defenders of Nargothrond," he said. "They have fought in battles most men could not imagine. If you wish to stand among them, you will need to prove yourself." Turin's lips curved into a faint smile. "Then tell me where to begin." The days that followed were a test of Turin's strength, skill, and will. The warriors of Nargothrond were not easily impressed, and they pushed him to his limits. They trained in the dim light of the cavern, their movements swift and precise, their weapons flashing like the strike of a hawk. Turin learned their ways, adapting his own style to match theirs. He was relentless, his focus unshakable. When he wielded his sword, it was as though the blade became an extension of his will, cutting through doubt and hesitation as easily as it did through the air. And though the warriors were slow to warm to him, they could not deny his prowess. They watched as he faced their best fighters in sparring matches, his movements a blur of power and precision. They saw the fire in his eyes, the unyielding determination that drove him forward. Gradually, the walls of distrust began to crumble. They began to see not just a man, but a kindred spirit, a warrior who had suffered and endured, who fought not for glory, but for something far deeper. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of training, Turin stood by the river that ran through the city. The water shimmered in the soft light, its surface as smooth as glass. He stared into its depths, his thoughts heavy. The weight of his past pressed against him, the memories of those he had lost, the choices he had made. He felt a presence beside him and turned to see an elf standing there, her silver hair catching the light like a halo. "You fight as though you have something to prove," she said, her voice soft but firm. Turin looked at her, his expression guarded. "Perhaps I do." She studied him for a moment, her gaze searching. "The people here are not quick to trust, and they have good reason. But trust is not given, it is earned. And you have begun to earn it." Turin nodded, but he said nothing. He turned back to the river, his reflection staring back at him like a ghost. He thought of his father, bound and tormented by Morgoth. He thought of his mother and sister, lost and vulnerable in a world of shadow. The fire in his chest burned brighter, fueling his resolve. Whatever it took, he would not falter. Far above, beyond the cavern walls, the dark clouds of Morgoth's malice gathered, spreading like a sickness across the land. And within the heart of Nargothrond, Turin sharpened his blade, preparing for the battles that awaited. The messenger stumbled into the hall, his face pale, his breaths ragged. His cloak was torn, and his boots were caked with mud from the long road south. The moment he appeared, every voice in the room fell silent. The sound of his footsteps, uneven and hurried, echoed through the high-vaulted chamber. He stopped just short of the throne where Orodreth sat, and the tension in the air was as sharp as a drawn blade. "The dragon moves," the messenger said, his voice cracking. "Glaurung marches from the north." A murmur rippled through the gathered elves, a sound like the wind stirring dry leaves. The weight of those words pressed down on every heart. Glaurung. The name alone was enough to conjure images of fire and ruin, of villages reduced to ash and lives torn apart. Some among them had witnessed the dragon's wrath firsthand, others had only heard the stories. But none doubted the threat he posed. Turin stood apart from the rest, his arms crossed, his jaw tight. His dark eyes locked on the messenger, and his mind raced. This was no idle rumor. The fear in the man's voice, the exhaustion in his steps, these were the marks of truth. He turned his gaze to Orodreth, who sat stiffly on his throne, his face carefully composed. "How far?" Orodreth asked, his voice calm but low. 2 weeks' march, the messenger replied, swallowing hard. "Less, if he pushes hard. He burns everything in his path. Nothing stands against him." Turin's hand moved instinctively to the hilt of his sword. The air seemed to grow heavier with every passing moment. He could feel the weight of the silence in the room, the unspoken fear that hung over them like a storm cloud. "We cannot wait for him to come to our gates," Turin said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "If we do nothing, Nargothrond will fall." Some of the gathered elves turned to look at him, their expressions a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Turin was still an outsider to many of them, a mortal among immortals, a man who had carved a place for himself in their hidden city but had not yet earned their unwavering trust. But in his voice, there was no hesitation, no doubt. He spoke as one who had faced the darkness and refused to bow. Orodreth leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the arms of his throne. "What would you have us do, Turin?" he asked, his tone even. "Strike first," Turin said without hesitation. "Meet him on the field before he reaches us. We have the strength. We have the warriors. If we stand together, we can stop him." The hall erupted into a cacophony of voices. Some nodded in agreement, their faces set with determination. Others shook their heads, their fear plain to see. Orodreth raised a hand, and the room fell silent once more. "To march against Glaurung is to march toward death," one of the older elves said, his voice trembling. "His power is beyond anything we have faced. To confront him head-on would be madness. And to do nothing is to invite death into our homes," Turin shot back, his voice rising. "Glaurung will not spare Nargothrond because we hide in the shadows. He will burn this city to the ground as he has burned so many others. If we stand idle, we doom ourselves." His words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. Orodreth's gaze was fixed on him, unreadable. For a moment, the two men locked eyes, the tension between them palpable. Turin could see the doubt in the elf lord's face, the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. But he could also see something else, a flicker of fear, not for himself, but for the people he had sworn to protect. "I will not lead my people to their deaths," Orodreth said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "You will lead them to slaughter if you do nothing," Turin said, stepping forward. There was a fire in his eyes now, a fierce, unrelenting light. "We cannot wait for the enemy to decide our fate. We must decide it for ourselves." Orodreth looked away, his expression troubled. The hall was silent once more, the weight of the decision pressing down on every soul present. Turin felt a pang of frustration, a sharp edge of anger that threatened to spill over. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to take a steadying breath. He had seen this hesitation before, in other leaders, in other battles. It was the hesitation that turned victory into defeat. "Think of what we stand to lose," Turin said, his voice softer now but no less intense. "Our homes. Our families. Everything we have built here. If Glaurung reaches Nargothrond, there will be no mercy. No second chance. We must act." A long silence followed his words. Orodreth stared at the floor, his hands gripping the arms of his throne. The gathered elves exchanged uneasy glances, their fear and doubt etched on their faces. Turin felt the weight of their indecision, the crushing pressure of time slipping away. The river beyond the hall continued to flow, its steady rhythm a stark contrast to the chaos brewing in their hearts. The sound of the water seemed to whisper of things to come, a warning that none could ignore. And yet, the decision remained unmade, the future uncertain. Outside the walls of Nargothrond, the shadows in the north grew darker, stretching ever closer. The ground trembled beneath the weight of the dragon's approach, and the sky above seemed to hold its breath. The moment of choice loomed, and with it, the promise of fire and blood. The forge blazed with a heat that seemed to pierce the skin, its light casting long shadows against the rough-hewn walls of the cavern. Sparks danced like restless spirits, rising and fading in the thick air. Turin stood at the edge of the heat, his face streaked with soot, his eyes locked on the figure at the anvil. Every clang of the hammer against steel echoed through the chamber, a relentless rhythm that matched the pounding in his chest. The blade that lay on the anvil was not yet whole. Its edges were jagged, its surface marred by the violence of its past. But there was power in it still, a cold, dormant fury waiting to be unleashed. Turin's hand rested lightly on the hilt of his broken sword, the metal cool against his skin. It was a relic of battles fought and lost, a reminder of choices that could not be undone. But now, it was to be reborn. The blacksmith moved with an otherworldly precision, his hand steady, his strikes deliberate. His face was hidden beneath the shadow of a hood, and his voice, when he spoke, carried a weight that made the air itself seem heavier. "This blade will not serve you lightly," the blacksmith said, his tone low and measured. "Its edge will cut not only flesh, but fate itself. Do you understand what you ask of it?" Turin's jaw tightened, and he nodded. "I understand." The blacksmith paused, his hammer hovering over the blade. For a moment, the forge seemed to dim, the flames shrinking back as though wary of what was being forged within their grasp. "Every blade has a cost," the blacksmith said, his voice tinged with something that might have been sorrow. "And this one carries a burden greater than most. It will drink the blood of your enemies, yes, but it may also demand a toll you are not willing to pay." Turin met the blacksmith's gaze, though the shadow of the hood obscured the man's eyes. There was no hesitation in him, no wavering in his resolve. "If the blade can help me destroy Glaurung, I will bear whatever burden it brings." The blacksmith said nothing for a long moment. Then he lowered the hammer, and the forge roared back to life. The sound of metal meeting metal filled the chamber, each strike sending a shower of sparks into the air. Turin watched as the blade began to take shape, its surface dark and gleaming, its edges razor-sharp. There was a beauty to it, but it was a beauty born of destruction, of fire and fury and unrelenting will. As the hours passed, Turin found his thoughts drifting. He thought of the lives the blade would claim, the enemies it would fell. He thought of the friends he had lost, the family he had left behind. And he thought of the dragon, its eyes burning with malice, its breath scorching the earth. This sword would be his answer to that terror. It would be the tool of his vengeance, the instrument of his defiance. When the blade was finally complete, the blacksmith held it up to the light. It was a thing of dark perfection, its surface polished to a mirror-like sheen, its edges gleaming with a deadly promise. He turned to Túrin, his expression unreadable. "It is done," the blacksmith said. "But remember this, the blade is not your servant. It is your equal. Treat it with respect, or it will turn against you." Túrin stepped forward, his hand reaching for the hilt. The moment his fingers closed around it, he felt a jolt of something, power, perhaps, or destiny. The blade seemed to hum in his grasp, a low, resonant sound that was almost too faint to hear. It felt alive, as though it were more than just metal and edge. "What will you call it?" the blacksmith asked, his voice soft. Túrin thought for a moment, the weight of the blade settling in his hand. "Gurthang," he said finally. "Iron of death." The blacksmith nodded, a flicker of something passing across his face. Approval, perhaps, or resignation. He turned back to the forge, his work done, his presence already fading into the background. But his final words lingered in the air, their meaning sinking into Túrin's mind like the edge of a blade. "Be careful, Túrin, son of Hurin. Gurthang is a weapon of great power, but it is also a weapon of great peril. It will guide you to victory, but it may also lead you to ruin." Túrin did not reply. He turned and left the forge, the weight of Gurthang heavy in his hand, the blacksmith's words heavy in his heart. The air outside the chamber was cool against his skin, but it did little to ease the tension coiled within him. The blade at his side seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, a silent reminder of what it was and what it could do. He tightened his grip on the hilt, his resolve hardening. Whatever the cost, he would wield Gurthang against the dragon. The shadows in the north were growing, and the fires that fueled them could not be ignored. The sword had been forged, and the path ahead was clear. Or so he told himself, as the wind carried whispers of the unknown. The great hall was filled with the murmurs of uncertainty, voices overlapping like the rustle of dry leaves before a storm. Torches flickered against the stone walls, casting restless shadows that danced across the room. Orodreth sat upon his throne, his face carved with worry. The weight of his people's lives rested heavily on his shoulders, and the choices before him seemed equally dire. It was into this charged atmosphere that Túrin stepped, his presence commanding attention without a word. When Túrin finally spoke, his voice was clear and unyielding. "We cannot wait any longer," he said, stepping forward so all eyes turned to him. "Every moment we hesitate, Glaurung draws closer. His flames will consume us if we do nothing." The weight of his words pressed down on the room. Faces turned to one another, some grim, others frightened. Orodreth's hand gripped the arm of his chair, his knuckles white. "And what would you have us do, Túrin?" he asked, his voice measured but weary. Túrin's gaze didn't waver. "We fight," he said, his tone brimming with the fierce certainty of a man who had already accepted the risks. "But we do not meet him in open battle. That is a fool's errand. We use the land to our advantage. We draw him where he is vulnerable, into the woods." A sharp intake of breath rippled through the room. The thought of confronting Glaurung at all was terrifying enough. To lure him into a trap seemed like inviting death into their midst. Túrin turned slowly, letting his gaze fall on the faces of the gathered warriors, the council members, the people who would bear the burden of his plan. "I know what you're thinking," Túrin said, his voice softer now but no less intense. "You think it's madness. But listen to me, Glaurung is not invincible. He is powerful, yes, and cunning, but he has his weaknesses. His size, his arrogance, these can be turned against him. If we strike in the right place, at the right time, we can bring him down." A murmur spread through the crowd, doubt mingling with a flicker of hope. Orodreth leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "And what place, what time, do you propose?" Turin stepped closer to the map spread across the table in the center of the hall. His finger traced the contours of the land, coming to rest on a dense patch of forest not far from the city's borders. "Here," he said. "The woods are thick, the terrain uneven. It will slow him, confuse him. We will set traps, ditches, barricades, anything that will force him to fight on our terms." Orodreth's eyes narrowed as he studied the map. "And what of the fire?" he asked. "Glaurung's flames could turn the entire forest into a death trap for us." Turin nodded, acknowledging the danger. "That's why we must act quickly. We position archers in the trees, warriors in the shadows. We use the forest to contain him, to strike from where he cannot see. We do not give him the chance to unleash his full power." The room fell silent, the weight of his plan settling over them. It was bold, audacious, and fraught with peril. But it was also their best chance. Orodreth's gaze lingered on Turin, his eyes searching for any sign of doubt. He found none. "And who will lead this assault?" Orodreth asked finally. "I will," Turin said without hesitation. His voice was steady, his resolve unshaken. "This is my plan, my responsibility. I will not ask anyone to face danger I am not willing to face myself." For a moment, no one spoke. Then one of the warriors stepped forward, his expression grim but determined. "If Turin will fight, so will I," he said. Another voice echoed his sentiment, then another. One by one, the warriors of Nargothrond pledged themselves to the cause, their fear tempered by the strength of their resolve. Orodreth rose from his throne, his decision made. "Very well," he said. "We will prepare. But know this, Turin, the lives of these people are in your hands. If we fail—" "We won't fail," Turin interrupted, his voice firm. "We can't." The hall buzzed with activity as the meeting broke up, plans and preparations already taking shape. Turin remained by the map, his fingers tracing the path Glaurung would take, the positions his warriors would hold. The weight of what lay ahead pressed against him, but he bore it without flinching. As the torches burned low, Orodreth approached him, his expression somber. "You have given them hope," he said quietly. "But hope is a fragile thing." Turin looked up, his eyes hard. "Hope is all we have," he said. "And sometimes, it's enough." Orodreth studied him for a moment, then nodded. "May it be so," he said, and turned away. Turin remained by the map long after the hall had emptied, the shadows growing long around him. The plan was set, the trap laid. But the path ahead was uncertain, the outcome far from assured. The forest loomed in his mind's eye, dark and foreboding, a place where fate and fire would collide. The earth trembled beneath their feet, a low, ominous rumble that seemed to grow stronger with every passing moment. The air carried the acrid scent of smoke and ash, a warning that needed no words. From the northern horizon, a crimson glow stained the darkening sky, flickering and alive, as if the heavens themselves had caught fire. Glaurung was coming. Turin stood at the edge of the gathered warriors, his gaze fixed on the distance where the glow intensified, marking the dragon's advance. He could almost feel the beast's presence, a looming, malevolent weight pressing down on the world. The men around him whispered prayers or gripped their weapons tighter, their faces pale but determined. Turin allowed them no time for doubt. "Steel yourselves," he said, his voice steady and clear, cutting through the murmur like a blade. "Fear is a weapon he will use against you. Do not let him see it." He glanced at the faces turned toward him, seeing in their eyes both terror and trust. These were not hardened soldiers, they were farmers, craftsmen, young men who had never seen true battle. But they were all that stood between Glaurung and the lives behind them. Turin knew that courage was born not in the absence of fear, but in the act of standing firm despite it. And so he stood, unyielding, his own fear buried beneath layers of resolve. The first sign of the dragon's approach was the roar, deep, guttural, and rolling like thunder across the land. It shook the air, sending birds scattering from the trees, their cries lost in the overwhelming sound. Then came the fire. A searing column of flame shot into the sky, igniting the treetops in a blaze that turned night into day. The light reflected in the wide eyes of Turin's men, and he could see the doubt creeping in. "Look at me," he commanded, his voice cutting through the chaos. "You are not alone. Stand together, and we will bring him down." The words seemed to anchor them, pulling them back from the edge of despair. Swords were drawn, shields raised. Túrin turned his gaze back to the fire, his hand resting on Gurthang's hilt. The sword pulsed faintly against his palm, as if eager for the battle to come. From the inferno of the forest, Glaurung emerged. His massive form was a nightmare of scales and sinew, his eyes burning with a cruel intelligence. Smoke curled from his nostrils, and his teeth glinted like polished ivory. The ground quaked with each step he took, the weight of his body tearing the earth apart. He paused at the edge of the clearing, his head rising high to survey the land before him. When his gaze fell on Túrin and his men, the dragon's lips curled into something resembling a smile. "So, they send lambs to the slaughter," Glaurung's voice boomed, resonating in the bones of those who heard it. "Do you think your pitiful weapons can harm me?" Túrin stepped forward, his sword gleaming in the firelight. "We'll see," he said, his tone cold and defiant. He raised Gurthang, the blade catching the flames and reflecting them back like a second sun. Glaurung's laughter rumbled like distant thunder. "Brave words for a doomed fool. Come, then. Show me what courage looks like when it burns." The dragon surged forward with terrifying speed, his jaws snapping, his tail lashing. Fire erupted from his maw, a torrent of destruction that scorched the ground and sent waves of heat rolling over the defenders. But Túrin was already in motion, shouting orders that cut through the chaos. "Break apart. Stay out of his flame. Archers, now!" From the shadows of the forest, arrows flew, their tips glinting in the firelight. They struck Glaurung's hide but glanced off, leaving only faint scratches. The dragon roared in irritation, his tail sweeping through the trees, shattering trunks like brittle twigs. Men scrambled to avoid the devastation, their movements quick and frantic. Túrin moved like a shadow, darting between bursts of flame and the massive swipes of claws. He struck at Glaurung's flanks, his blade seeking any weak point in the dragon's armor. Sparks flew as Gurthang met scales, but the dragon's hide was nearly impervious. Still, Túrin pressed on, his strikes relentless, his shouts rallying the others to keep fighting. Glaurung turned his attention to Túrin, his golden eyes narrowing. "You're the one they whisper about," the dragon hissed, his voice low and venomous. "The cursed son of Túrin. Do you think your fate can stand against mine?" Túrin met the dragon's gaze, his grip tightening on his sword. "Your fate ends here," he said, his voice as sharp as the blade in his hand. Glaurung lunged, his jaws snapping shut just inches from Túrin, who rolled to the side and came up slashing. The blade bit into the softer flesh near the dragon's jaw, drawing a thin line of blood. Glaurung roared in fury, the sound shaking the very ground, and unleashed a stream of fire that narrowly missed Túrin as he dove behind a fallen tree. The dragon's rage grew, his movements more erratic and destructive. But Túrin's men, emboldened by their leader's fearless defiance, struck from the shadows, their coordinated attacks harrying the beast. Though their blows did little damage, they kept Glaurung's attention divided, forcing him to lash out in all directions. Túrin saw his chance. As Glaurung turned to incinerate a group of archers, Túrin sprinted forward, Gurthang raised high. He aimed for the vulnerable spot he had glimpsed beneath the dragon's massive neck, the place where scales gave way to softer flesh. With a shout that tore from his very soul, Túrin brought the blade down. The forest was alive with chaos. Flames licked the sky, casting jagged shadows across the battlefield, and the acrid scent of smoke filled every breath. Screams and roars echoed in the dark, a violent symphony of man against monster. Túrin stood at the center of it all, Gurthang gleaming in his hands, his eyes locked on the towering beast before him. Every muscle in his body was coiled like a spring, ready to strike. This was the moment everything had led to, the knife's edge between triumph and annihilation. Glaurung's massive form loomed, his scales shimmering like molten gold in the firelight. He moved with an unsettling grace, his claws gouging deep furrows into the earth, his tail leaving destruction in its wake. His eyes, those terrible, golden orbs, scanned the battlefield with chilling intelligence. When they landed on Turin, they seemed to burn with a cruel amusement. "You think you can end me, child?" the dragon snarled, his voice as deep as the earth's core. "You will be nothing more than ash beneath my feet." Turin didn't answer. Words were useless now. He raised Gurthang in silent defiance, its dark blade catching the flicker of flames, its edge sharp enough to cut through fate itself. He could feel its weight in his hands, the hum of power beneath his grip. The sword was a part of him now, an extension of his will. Glaurung surged forward, his bolt tearing through the battlefield like a storm. Fire erupted from his maw, a searing wall of heat and death that consumed everything in its path. Turin darted to the side, rolling beneath a fallen tree as the flames roared overhead. His men scrambled to keep the dragon distracted, arrows raining down from the treetops and spears glancing off his armored hide. The forest itself seemed to rebel against Glaurung's presence. Trees cracked and splintered under his weight, their ancient limbs falling like wounded giants. The ground trembled with each step he took, but Turin's mind was steady, calculating. He could see the pattern in the chaos, the rhythm of the dragon's movements. Glaurung was powerful, yes, but his arrogance made him predictable. Turin shouted orders, his voice cutting through the din. "Hold your ground. Strike and move. Do not give him a target." His warriors obeyed, their fear tempered by his unwavering resolve. They fought like shadows, darting in and out of the dragon's reach, harrying him with blades and arrows. Glaurung roared in frustration, his tail lashing out to catch one of the men. The soldier flew through the air, landing with a sickening thud, but the others held their ground. Turin saw his chance. As Glaurung turned to swipe at another group of fighters, Turin sprinted forward, Gurthang raised high. The dragon's scales were impenetrable in most places, but there, beneath his massive neck, lay a vulnerable gap where soft flesh pulsed with the beat of his dark heart. With a shout that tore from the depths of his soul, Turin leaped, Gurthang aimed true. Time seemed to slow as the blade descended, cutting through the chaos like a shard of night. It pierced the dragon's hide, sliding deep into the heart of the beast. Glaurung's roar split the air, a sound so loud it seemed to shake the heavens. His body convulsed, massive claws tearing at the earth as fire spewed from his maw in one last, desperate surge. Turin clung to Gurthang, his muscles straining as the dragon thrashed beneath him. The world was a blur of heat and light, pain and fury. Then, with a final, shuddering breath, Glaurung collapsed. The ground quaked beneath his massive form, and a deafening silence fell over the battlefield. Smoke hung in the air like a shroud, the glow of the flames dimming as the dragon's life ebbed away. Turin stood over the fallen beast, his chest heaving, his hand still gripping the hilt of Gurthang. Blood, thick and dark, oozed from the wound, pooling around his feet. The dragon's eyes, once so full of malice and power, were now dull, staring sightlessly into the night. The men of Nargothrond emerged from the shadows, their faces pale and streaked with soot, their eyes wide with disbelief. They had done the impossible. Together, they had brought down the father of dragons. But as they looked upon Turin, standing tall and unbroken amidst the carnage, they saw not just a warrior but a legend in the making. The silence stretched on, broken only by the crackling of dying flames. Then, one by one, the men began to cheer, a sound born not just of victory, but of sheer, unrelenting hope. The halls of Nargothrond were alive with music and laughter. Golden light spilled from countless torches, illuminating the carved walls and shimmering on the goblets raised high in celebration. The air was thick with the scent of roasted meats and spiced wine, a feast fit for the gods. Men and women sang songs of triumph, their voices rising together in jubilant harmony. The shadow of Glaurung had been lifted, and for the first time in memory, the people felt free to rejoice without fear. But amid the revelry, Turin sat apart. His face was etched with a quiet unease, his eyes distant as they stared into the dark liquid of his untouched goblet. The sounds of joy around him seemed muffled, as though they came from another world. The weight of Gurthang, sheathed at his side, felt heavier than ever, a silent reminder of the battle just fought. He should have been elated. He had done what few could dream of. He had slain the mighty dragon, a creature of unspeakable terror. Yet the victory tasted bitter, like ashes on his tongue. The echoes of Glaurung's dying roar still lingered in his mind, along with the beast's last, venomous words. There had been no curse this time, no trickery, only a cold, ominous warning. The shadows you strike at will rise again, stronger and darker. You will not escape them. Across the hall, Orodreth raised a goblet in Turin's honor, his voice booming over the crowd. To Turin, the Dragon Slayer. Without him, we would not be here tonight. The hall erupted in cheers, a roar of gratitude and adoration that swept over Turin like a tide. He forced a small smile, nodding in acknowledgement, but the weight in his chest did not lift. He rose from his seat, the motion catching the attention of a few nearby. "I need air," he muttered, though no one had asked. The crowd parted for him as he made his way to the great doors, their laughter fading behind him. Outside, the night was cool and quiet. The stars glittered above, their light pale and cold compared to the warmth of the feast. Turin inhaled deeply, the crisp air filling his lungs and clearing his mind. He walked to the edge of the great stone bridge, gazing out over the river below. The water glimmered faintly in the starlight, its gentle current a stark contrast to the turmoil in his heart. He was not alone for long. A soft rustle of fabric announced the arrival of Finduilas. She stepped beside him, her golden hair gleaming in the starlight, her eyes searching his face. "Why are you out here?" she asked gently. "The people are celebrating because of you. They owe you their lives." Turin shook his head. "It's not that simple," he said, his voice low. "Glaurung is gone, but the threat isn't over. I can feel it, like a storm gathering on the horizon." Finduilas placed a hand on his arm, her touch light but steady. "You've given them hope, Turin. That is no small thing. Whatever comes next, they will face it stronger because of you." He looked at her, seeing the sincerity in her eyes, but the unease inside him remained. He thought of Morgoth, the Dark Lord who had sent Glaurung to sow destruction. Morgoth would not let this victory go unanswered. Turin could almost sense the malice stirring far to the north, a shadow darker than any dragon's wing. Far away, in the depths of Angband, Morgoth's wrath burned like a forge. The death of Glaurung was a wound to his pride, a crack in his carefully laid plans. His servants cowered as his fury lashed out, his voice a tempest of rage. "The son of Hurin," he spat, the name a curse on his lips. "He dares defy me, time and again." Morgoth's eyes, like twin pits of fire, turned to his lieutenants. "He will pay for this insolence. The dragon's death is but a momentary reprieve. I will bring ruin upon him and all he holds dear. Let him know the price of defying the will of Morgoth." His servants bowed low, their forms trembling, and hurried to carry out his commands. The wheels of darkness began to turn, setting in motion a vengeance that would seek to crush not just Turin, but the fragile hope he had inspired. Back on the bridge, Turin turned away from the river, his jaw set. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning, that the shadow he had fought so hard to dispel was merely regrouping, preparing to strike again. His hand rested on Gurthang's hilt, the blade silent but ever present. Behind him, the lights of Nargothrond glowed warmly, the sounds of celebration faint in the distance. The people had earned their joy, their moment of peace. But Turin knew that peace was fragile, a delicate thing that could shatter with the next blow. The stars above seemed colder now, their light distant and uncaring. The night stretched on, vast and unending, as Turin stood on the edge of what he had won, and what he feared was still to come. The night offered no comfort. Turin lay on his bed, drenched in sweat, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The fire in the hearth had burned low, casting flickering shadows that seemed to move with a will of their own. His dreams had been vivid and relentless, visions of ruin and despair that left his heart pounding and his spirit shaken. He saw Glaurung again, not as a lifeless corpse but alive, his golden eyes blazing with cruel amusement. Did you think you had won, son of Túrin? The dragon hissed, his voice echoing like a storm. Your blade is sharp, but it cannot cut through the chains that bind you. The scene shifted, and Turin found himself in a vast, desolate plain. The sky above was a sickly shade of gray, and the ground beneath his feet was scorched and cracked. He was surrounded by shadowy figures, their faces obscured, but their whispers unmistakable, words of betrayal, fear, and doubt. As he reached for Gurthang, his hand passed through the hilt as though it were smoke. He woke with a start, the whispers still echoing in his ears. The room felt stifling, the air thick with an oppressive weight. He sat up, running a trembling hand through his hair. The dreams felt too real, too vivid to dismiss as mere figments of his mind. In the dim light, his eyes fell on Gurthang, propped against the wall. The blade seemed to shimmer faintly, as though alive with a presence of its own. Turin couldn't shake the feeling that the sword was watching him, judging him. The days that followed were uneasy. Though Nargothrond still hummed with the echoes of celebration, an undercurrent of tension began to creep in. It was subtle at first, strained conversations, fleeting glances, a growing sense of restlessness among the people. Turin noticed it most keenly among his closest allies. Beleg, ever loyal and steadfast, had grown quieter, his eyes clouded with something Turin couldn't name. Findula's, once a source of gentle strength, seemed distracted, her laughter coming less often. Even Orodreth, who had stood so firmly by his side, now seemed weighed down by doubt. It was as though an invisible hand was pulling at the threads of their unity, unraveling the bonds they had forged in fire and blood. The whispers began soon after. They started in the corners of the great halls, carried by those who spoke in hushed tones, their words laced with suspicion. Did Turin bring the curse upon us? Some asked. The dragon is slain, but at what cost? Others spoke of Morgoth's wrath, wondering if the victory had merely drawn his eye more keenly to their hidden sanctuary. Turin heard the whispers but said nothing. Confronting them would only fan the flames, and he had no answers to give. Instead, he threw himself into his duties, training the warriors and fortifying their defenses. But even as he worked, he couldn't escape the feeling that something dark was moving against him. Far to the north, Morgoth's agents were already at work. They came in many forms, spies hidden among merchants, travelers bearing poisoned gifts, and whispers carried on the wind. They spoke of Turin's pride, of his cursed lineage, of the doom that followed him like a shadow. They fed on fear and doubt, planting seeds that took root in the hearts of the unsuspecting. One evening, Turin returned from the training grounds to find Beleg waiting for him. The older warrior's face was grave, his hands clenched at his sides. Turin, Beleg began, his voice heavy, there are those who question your place here. They say the dragon's death has brought only more danger. Turin's jaw tightened. And do you believe them? Beleg hesitated, his silence cutting deeper than words. I don't blame you, Turin said at last, his voice low. If I were in your place, I might wonder the same. But I cannot change who I am, nor the burden I carry. All I can do is fight. And if the fight leads us to ruin? Beleg asked, his gaze unflinching. Turin turned away, his hand resting on Gurthang's hilt. Then I will bear that ruin alone. That night, the dreams returned. This time, they were darker, more vivid. He saw Nargothrond in flames, its people fleeing as shadowy figures descended upon them. He saw himself standing alone on a desolate battlefield, blood dripping from Gurthang, his hands stained with more than the blood of his enemies. When he woke, he found himself clutching the hilt of his sword, his knuckles white with strain. The weight of the dreams pressed down on him, an invisible chain he couldn't break. Morgoth's shadow was growing, its tendrils reaching ever closer. And though Turin stood tall, the cracks in his armor were beginning to show. The throne room of Nargothrond was silent. The air felt heavy, as if the stones themselves were holding their breath. Turin stood at the center, his hand resting on the hilt of Gurthang. Around him, the lords and warriors of the realm gathered, their faces a mixture of awe, fear, and defiance. The death of Orodreth had left a void, one that no one had been prepared to fill. But Túrin did not ask for permission to step into the space. It was as if fate had dragged him there, leaving no room for argument. There was no coronation, no declaration of kingship. Yet when Túrin spoke, the people listened. His voice, strong and unyielding, cut through the room like a blade. The shadow of the north looms over us all. If we hesitate, it will consume us. I will not stand idle while the world burns. Follow me, and we will strike first. If any man doubts my resolve, step forward now. No one moved. But among the crowd, whispers churned like a restless sea. Some called him a savior, the man who had slain Glaurung and restored hope to a dying people. Others saw only his pride, his sharp words, and the shadow of his lineage. A mortal man cannot rule over an elven kingdom, some muttered. He carries the curse of Morgoth in his blood, others whispered in darker corners. But none dared voice these doubts in the open. Not yet. The days that followed were a whirlwind of decisions and actions. Túrin restructured the defenses of Nargothrond, fortifying its hidden gates and rallying its warriors. His strategies were bold, his plans ruthless. He sought to turn Nargothrond from a place of quiet refuge into a force of power and defiance. We will not hide, he declared. We will not cower in the shadows while others die. If war comes, we will meet it with fire and steel. Alliances began to form, though they were far from easy. Messengers were sent to the elven realms of Doriath and the surviving havens of Beleriand. Some leaders saw the wisdom in Túrin's plans and pledged their aid, though their words were often tinged with caution. Others refused outright, unwilling to place their trust in a man who bore the weight of so many tragedies. In one such council, Túrin faced the lord of an ancient elven house. The elf, tall and proud, looked at Túrin with a gaze that pierced to his core. You speak of unity, but your actions sow discord, the elf said. You wield strength, but strength alone cannot lead. What do you offer beyond your sword? Túrin's jaw tightened, his hand curling into a fist. I offer the will to fight, he said, his voice low but fierce. I offer the refusal to bow before the shadow. If that is not enough for you, then stay in your halls and wait for the darkness to find you. The council ended in uneasy silence. Yet despite the tensions, alliances did begin to form. Warriors arrived in small numbers, their banners carrying the marks of distant lands. Supplies came in wagons, gifts from those who dared to believe in Túrin's cause. Still, mistrust lingered in every corner of the kingdom. The elves who had long called Nargothrond their home struggled to see this mortal man as their leader. And Túrin, though he carried himself with the bearing of a king, could feel the weight of their doubt pressing down on him like an iron chain. One night, as he walked through the halls, Túrin overheard a conversation between two guards. They spoke in hushed tones, their words sharp and unkind. He speaks of war as if it's a game, one said. But what does he know of the cost? We have lost so much already. Can he promise us anything but more death? And yet he killed Glaurung, the other replied. Would you have preferred the dragon to rule us instead? The first guard fell silent, but his expression spoke volumes. It was not hatred or anger that clouded his face, but fear, a fear that Túrin recognized all too well. That fear followed him everywhere, a shadow that refused to be shaken. Even as he stood before his people, rallying them with words of defiance and hope, he could feel it in their eyes. They wanted to believe, but belief was a fragile thing. And in the quiet moments, when the halls of Nargothrond were still and the weight of his decisions bore down on him, Túrin wondered if he was leading them to salvation or ruin. The dreams continued, haunting him with visions of what might come. He saw himself standing atop a mountain of corpses, the faces of the dead twisted in pain. He saw the walls of Nargothrond crumbling, its banners torn and trampled in the mud. And he saw Morgoth, his eyes burning with malice, watching from the shadows with a cruel smile. But Túrin was not a man to be swayed by dreams or doubt. He clenched his fists and set his jaw, refusing to let the darkness take hold. I will not falter, he whispered to himself. Not now. Not ever. Still, the question lingered in the back of his mind, Could strength alone be enough to hold a kingdom together? And if it wasn't, what would be left when the strength gave way? The wind howled through the quiet halls of Nargothrond, carrying whispers that no walls could keep out. Turin sat alone in the shadow chamber where his sword, Gurthang, lay sheathed before him. The firelight flickered, casting dancing shapes against the cold stone. His heart, so often hardened against fear and doubt, now felt pierced by something far more insidious, uncertainty. A messenger had come earlier that day, bearing words that struck deeper than any blade. News of his family, his mother, Morwen, and his sister, Ninor, had reached him, but it was not the reunion he had long imagined. Their plight was dire, and his absence had left them vulnerable to a fate he dared not name. The weight of the revelation crushed him. All the victories he had fought for, all the blood spilled to protect this hidden kingdom, felt hollow in that moment. His mind churned with questions he could not answer. Were they alive? Were they safe? The words of the messenger were vague, filled with uncertainty and fear. Yet one thing was clear: Turin's family needed him, and the guilt of his absence gnawed at his soul. He clenched his fists until his knuckles turned white. The memory of his childhood came rushing back, Morwen, proud and unyielding, standing tall against the tide of despair that had swept through their lives. Ninor, her laughter like sunlight breaking through the darkest clouds. They had been his anchor in a world of chaos, and now they were out there, suffering. The thought was unbearable. Turin rose abruptly, the scraping of his chair against the stone floor echoing in the empty room. He paced like a caged wolf, his mind torn between his duty to Nargothrond and the pull of his bloodline. The warriors he led trusted him, and the people saw him as their protector. Yet how could he protect them while his heart was scattered across the lands, searching for the faces he longed to see again? In the days that followed, Turin's turmoil did not go unnoticed. His once commanding presence seemed tinged with an invisible weight, a shadow that darkened his steps. Those closest to him dared not speak of it openly, but whispers spread through the corridors. "The Dragonslayer is troubled," they said. "What haunts him now?" Late one evening, Finduilas approached him. Her eyes, filled with a mixture of concern and something unspoken, searched his face. "You carry a burden you do not share," she said softly. "What troubles you, Turin?" He hesitated, his jaw tightening as if the words were a chain he had to break. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but steady. "My mother and sister, they are not safe. They have suffered while I have been here, waging battles that feel meaningless in the face of their plight." Finduilas' expression softened, but there was pain in her eyes. "You have done much for Nargothrond. But if your heart is elsewhere, how can you stand firm here?" The question lingered in the air, heavy and unanswered. Turin turned away, unable to meet her gaze. He knew she was right, but the path ahead felt like a knife's edge, one wrong step, and everything would fall apart. The decision came like a storm breaking over the mountains. Turin summoned his most trusted captains and informed them of his intent. The room erupted in a mix of shock and protest. "You cannot leave, my lord," one cried. "The strength of Nargothrond lies in your leadership." "We are on the brink of war," another added. "Without you, we are vulnerable." Turin raised a hand, silencing the room. His voice, though calm, carried the weight of his resolve. "I do not abandon this kingdom lightly," he said. "But my family is in peril, and I cannot ignore their plight. I leave you with the defenses I have built, and with the courage I know you possess. Trust in yourselves, as I trust in you." The protests died down, replaced by a somber acceptance. Yet the unease in the room was palpable. Turin's departure would leave a void, one that no strategy or fortress could fill. As the day of his departure approached, Turin prepared for the journey with grim determination. He donned his armor, each piece a reminder of the battles he had fought and the scars he carried. Gurthang hung at his side, its dark blade glinting in the light. It felt heavier than usual, as if it too bore the weight of his choices. The people of Nargothrond gathered to see him off, their faces a mixture of sorrow and hope. Some bowed their heads in respect, while others watched in silence, their expressions unreadable. Findula stood among them, her eyes meeting his one last time. There was no need for words, the silence between them spoke volumes. Turin mounted his steed, the horse's breath visible in the cold morning air. He looked back at the hidden gates of Nargothrond, the kingdom he had fought so hard to protect. For a moment, doubt threatened to consume him. But then he thought of Morwen and Ninor, their faces vivid in his mind, and the doubt melted away. As he rode into the horizon, the shadows of the past seemed to stretch out before him, mingling with the unknown dangers of the road ahead. The path was fraught with peril, and he knew the decision to leave Nargothrond might carry consequences he could not yet foresee. But for Turin, the call of family was stronger than the weight of a kingdom. He pressed onward, the thundering hooves of his steed echoing into the distance, a sound that carried both resolve and the faint tremor of a fate that remained unwritten. The skies above Nargothrond darkened unnaturally, the kind of oppressive gloom that settled deep into the bones and stole the courage of even the bravest hearts. The first sign came in the form of distant tremors, faint at first but soon unmistakable. Scouts returned breathless, their faces pale with terror. "They are coming," they said, voices trembling with fear. It was not just a raid or a skirmish, it was an onslaught. The vast armies of Morgoth surged from the north, a tide of orcs that stretched as far as the eye could see, their grotesque forms illuminated by the fiery glow of Balrogs towering behind them. The land itself seemed to groan beneath the weight of their advance. The air was thick with the acrid stench of burning earth, and the sound of countless marching feet rolled like thunder through the hills. Within the walls of Nargothrond, the air was taut with tension. The warriors prepared themselves for what they knew would be a battle unlike any they had faced before. Though Turin had left them with strategies and defenses, his absence was a gaping wound in their resolve. Leadership fell to the remaining captains, who scrambled to hold the fragile unity of the city together. Each decision carried the weight of countless lives, and hesitation could mean annihilation. The first clash came at the river crossing, where the defenders of Nargothrond had hoped to stem the tide. Archers lined the banks, their bows drawn tight, while swordsmen and spearmen formed a wall of steel behind them. As the orc horde surged forward, the defenders loosed a volley of arrows, darkening the sky with death. Screams erupted as the missiles found their mark, felling scores of the enemy. But for every orc that fell, 10 more seemed to rise from the shadows, driven forward by the relentless will of Morgoth. The ground shook violently as a Balrog strode into the fray, its fiery whip lashing out with unholy fury. It tore through the ranks of the defenders, scattering them like leaves in a storm. Desperation gripped the hearts of the warriors, but they fought on, their fear giving way to grim determination. Every blow struck was a prayer for survival, every shield raised a testament to their defiance. Within the city, panic spread like wildfire. The sound of battle grew closer with each passing moment, a cacophony of screams, clashing steel, and inhuman roars. Families huddled together in hidden chambers, their prayers mingling with the sobs of children who clung to their mothers. The ancient halls of Nargothrond, once a sanctuary of beauty and song, now echoed with the sounds of fear and anguish. The captains rallied what forces they could, determined to make a stand at the gates. They knew the odds were hopeless, but there was no other choice. The gates of Nargothrond, massive and unyielding, were the city's last line of defense. If they fell, there would be no escape. As the orcs reached the gates, the defenders unleashed every weapon at their disposal. Boiling oil rained down from above, scalding the attackers and sending them screaming back into the fray. Siege engines hurled massive stones, crushing the ranks of the enemy. For a moment, it seemed as though the line might hold. But then, the Balrogs came. The fire demons descended upon the gates with a ferocity that defied comprehension. Their whips cracked through the air, tearing through stone and steel as if they were paper. The heat of their presence was unbearable, and the very air seemed to ignite in their wake. The defenders fought valiantly, but they were no match for such ancient and terrible power. One by one, the gates began to buckle under the relentless assault. Within the walls, chaos reigned. As the gates finally gave way, the enemy poured into the city like a flood. Streets that had once been filled with laughter and song now ran red with blood. The defenders fought desperately to hold their ground, but the sheer numbers of the enemy overwhelmed them. Among the captains, a decision was made. If they could not save the city, they would at least save its people. A desperate evacuation began, with women, children, and the elderly being led through hidden tunnels carved into the rock. The warriors who remained behind fought with a ferocity born of sacrifice, buying precious moments for their loved ones to escape. One warrior, a grizzled veteran who had seen more battles than he cared to remember, stood at the forefront of the defense. His shield was splintered, his armor dented, but his spirit remained unbroken. As an orc charged at him, he sidestepped deftly and drove his blade into its heart. "For Nargothrond," he cried, his voice carrying over the din of battle. Others took up the call, their voices rising in a chorus of defiance. But defiance could not stop the tide. As the flames consumed the city, the last remnants of its defenders were driven back to the central hall. There, in the heart of Nargothrond, they made their final stand. The once grand chamber, adorned with tapestries and carvings that spoke of a proud history, became a battleground. Every pillar, every alcove, became a vantage point for archers or a place for swordsmen to make their stand. When the end came, it was swift and merciless. The Balrogs unleashed their full fury, reducing the hall to rubble. The remaining warriors fell one by one, their final moments a testament to their courage. And then, silence. Far away, Turin rode through the wilderness, his thoughts consumed by the faces of his mother and sister. He did not know of the devastation that had befallen Nargothrond, the kingdom he had left behind. But the shadow of Morgoth loomed ever closer, and its reach was far and unrelenting. The echoes of the battle still lingered in the air, carried by the wind like a mournful song, a reminder that victory often comes at a cost too great to bear. The forest was silent, save for the sound of Turin's boots crunching against the frosted leaves. Each step felt heavier than the last, weighed down not by the burdens of his pack, but by the memories he could not leave behind. The destruction of Nargothrond haunted him in the stillness of the woods, the cries of its people ringing in his ears like an unending echo. He clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. Silence was no solace, it only made the ghosts louder. The path ahead was jagged and uncertain, much like the man who walked it. Turin's sword, black and gleaming, hung at his side. Its weight was familiar, almost comforting, as though the blade understood the grief that festered within him. The cold wind whipped through the trees, carrying with it a reminder of his isolation. He had chosen this solitude, yet the emptiness gnawed at him like a living thing. His mother's face, his sister's laughter, they were a cruel balm, too distant to soothe, but close enough to wound. One night, under the canopy of stars, a distant flicker of firelight caught his eye. He approached cautiously, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. The outlaws didn't see him at first. They were huddled around the flames, laughing and swapping crude tales, their weapons resting nearby. Turin stepped into the light, his shadow stretching long and dark across the ground. The laughter died instantly. "Who goes there?" one of them barked, his voice cracking with a bravado that barely masked his fear. "A wanderer," Turin replied, his voice calm but edged with steel. "I seek neither shelter nor company. But if you mean harm, know that I will not hesitate to strike." The leader of the group, a grizzled man with a scar running down his cheek, studied Turin for a long moment. His eyes flicked to the black blade at Turin's side, and something in his expression shifted, respect mingled with unease. "You're welcome to the fire," he said gruffly. "But we don't take kindly to threats." Turin said nothing, seating himself at the edge of the fire's warmth. The outlaws returned to their conversations, though they kept a wary distance. As the hours stretched on, Turin listened, piecing together fragments of their lives. These were men who had lost everything, homes, families, their very sense of belonging. In their bitterness, he saw a reflection of himself. Yet there was a stark difference. Where their despair had driven them to theft and cruelty, Turin's had forged a resolve as unyielding as the blade at his side. Days turned into weeks, and Turin found himself drifting in and out of skirmishes with Morgoth's scattered forces. Orcs roamed the lands in ragged bands, remnants of the once mighty armies that had laid waste to Nargothrond. Each encounter was brutal and unrelenting, the stench of death clinging to the air long after the fighting had ceased. Turin fought with a ferocity that bordered on madness, his sword an extension of his rage. The black blade sang as it cleaved through flesh and bone, its dark surface gleaming with the blood of his enemies. But it was not only orcs who crossed his path. On one cold, rain-soaked morning, Turin stumbled upon a small village ravaged by war. The charred remains of homes stood like gravestones, and the few survivors huddled together, their faces hollow with despair. A child, no older than 5, clung to his mother's skirt, his wide eyes staring up at Turin with a mix of fear and wonder. "What happened here?" Turin asked, his voice quieter than usual. "Morgoth's filth," the woman spat, her voice trembling. "They came in the night. Took everything. My husband, my son." Her words broke into sobs, and Turin felt something twist inside him. He knelt, placing a hand on the child's shoulder. The boy flinched but did not pull away. "Your father's strength is in you," Turin said softly. "Hold on to it. The darkness will not last forever." The words tasted bitter in his mouth, a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. But the boy nodded, and for a moment, Turin saw a flicker of hope in his eyes. He left the village with a heaviness that no sword could lift, the image of the boy etched into his mind. As his journey continued, Turin began to notice a change within himself. The fire that had once driven him was burning lower, its flames flickering with doubt. He had always believed in his strength, his ability to carve his own path through the chaos of the world. But now, he questioned whether he was truly in control, or if he was merely a pawn in a game far greater than himself. One night, as he camped beneath a canopy of ancient trees, Turin dreamed. In his dream, he stood on a battlefield shrouded in mist. Figures loomed around him, some familiar, some faceless. His father, Túrin, stood at the forefront, his expression one of sorrow and pride. "Your path is not yet clear, my son," Túrin said, his voice echoing through the mist. "But remember this, strength without purpose is a blade without a hilt. It cuts both ways." Turin awoke with a start, his heart pounding. The words lingered in his mind, their meaning elusive but weighty. As the first light of dawn crept through the trees, he rose and prepared to move on. The road ahead was uncertain, but he would walk it all the same. For in the midst of his doubts, one truth remained: he was Túrin Turambar, and he would not yield to the darkness. The rain fell in heavy sheets, drenching the earth and muffling all sound. Turin stood on a narrow ridge, his dark hair plastered to his face, staring down at the figure lying limp in the mud below. A woman, fragile and unmoving, her form barely visible through the relentless downpour. Something deep within him stirred, a pull so fierce it felt like the hand of fate itself. He scrambled down the slope, the wet earth slicked beneath his boots, and knelt by her side. Her face was pale, her eyes closed. He called out to her, his voice trembling, "Are you hurt? Can you hear me?" For a moment, nothing. Then, her eyelids fluttered, and she looked up at him with a gaze that seemed both empty and infinite. There was a flicker of recognition in her expression, though Turin could not place why. Her lips moved, forming words too soft to hear over the storm. "You're safe now," he said, his voice firmer this time, though his heart pounded like a war drum. He wrapped his cloak around her trembling shoulders, the black fabric a stark contrast against her fragile frame. She allowed herself to be pulled to her feet, leaning heavily on him for support. He held her tightly, his mind racing with questions he dared not ask just yet. They found shelter beneath the gnarled roots of an ancient tree, its twisted branches forming a canopy that barely held back the rain. Turin built a fire, his fingers clumsy with the damp wood, but determination burned in his eyes. When the flames finally took, he turned to her. "What is your name?" he asked gently, his voice a balm against the storm's fury. She hesitated, her brows knitting in confusion. "Ninor," she said at last, though her voice was unsteady, as if the name did not entirely belong to her. The word struck Turin like a thunderclap. Ninor. The name hung in the air between them, fragile and heavy all at once. Turin's breath caught in his chest. He remembered his sister as a child, her laughter like sunlight breaking through a cloudy sky, her wide eyes filled with wonder at the world. Could this broken figure before him truly be her? He wanted to ask, to demand answers, but the look in her eyes stopped him. There was something veiled within them, an emptiness that whispered of unspeakable sorrow. He clenched his fists, the veins in his hands standing out like cords. Whatever had happened to her, whoever had done this, he would make them pay. Days passed, and the rain gave way to a pale sun. Ninor regained her strength, though her memories remained shrouded in mist. She walked beside Turin through the woods, her steps growing steadier with each passing day. There was a quietness about her, a fragile grace that seemed to draw the world's weight away from Turin's shoulders, if only for a moment. He found himself watching her when she wasn't looking, searching for signs of the girl he had once known. But Ninor was no longer a child. She was a woman now, her gaze carrying a depth that spoke of both wisdom and wounds. The bond between them grew stronger with each shared silence, each stolen glance. Turin's heart ached with a longing he could not name, a yearning that felt both beautiful and terrible. Yet shadows loomed at the edges of their fragile peace. At night, Ninor would wake screaming, her cries piercing the stillness. Turin would rush to her side, holding her trembling form as she sobbed into his chest. She spoke of visions, dark, formless shapes that pursued her through endless voids, whispers that clawed at her mind like talons. "They won't let me go," she whispered one night, her voice barely audible. "I try to run, but they always find me." Turin's jaw tightened, his arms wrapping around her protectively. "They will not touch you again," he vowed, his voice a low growl. "I will stand between you and the darkness." But the darkness was relentless, its tendrils reaching out in ways neither of them could foresee. One evening, as they rested by a brook, Turin noticed something strange. Ninor stared into the water, her reflection rippling in the current. Her face was serene, almost peaceful, but her eyes burned with an unnatural light, a flicker of something not entirely her own. "Ninor?" Turin called softly, his chest tightening with unease. She turned to him, and for a moment, her expression was foreign, as if she were seeing him for the first time. But then she smiled, and the moment passed like a shadow in the wind. Turin tried to shake off the unease that gnawed at him, but it lingered, a quiet whisper at the back of his mind. As the days turned to weeks, whispers of Morgotha's hand began to weave their way into Turin's thoughts. He saw it in the subtle shifts in Ninor's demeanor, the way her laughter would falter mid-note, her gaze growing distant as if she were staring into some unseen abyss. He tried to push the thoughts aside, to focus on the light they had found in each other amidst the encroaching darkness. But the curse was a living thing, its shadow growing longer with each passing day. One night, beneath a sky ablaze with stars, Turin turned to Ninor, his voice heavy with determination. "Whatever binds you to this darkness, I will break it," he said, his words filled with a fierce resolve. "You are not alone, Ninor. Not anymore." She looked at him, her eyes brimming with tears. For a moment, the shadows seemed to retreat, and the woman before him was the Ninor he remembered, unburdened and radiant. "I believe you," she whispered, her voice trembling with both hope and fear. But even as their bond deepened, the storm gathered on the horizon. Morgotha's curse was not a thing that could be easily undone. It lingered in the spaces between their words, in the silences that stretched too long, in the way Ninor's hand would sometimes tighten around Turin's as if she were clinging to the last light in a darkening world. The road ahead was fraught with uncertainty, each step carrying them closer to a fate neither could fully see. But they walked it together, bound by a love that was as fierce as it was fragile. And though the shadows loomed ever closer, the fire in Turin's heart burned bright, a defiance against the darkness that sought to consume them both. The forest of Doriath stood timeless and serene, its ancient trees rising like guardians of a forgotten world. Their branches intertwined high above, creating a canopy that filtered the sunlight into golden shards. Beneath this shelter, Turin entered, his steps slow but resolute. Every inch of him bore the weight of battles fought, wounds endured, and losses that refused to fade. Doriath, the realm of Thingol, was a sanctuary whispered of in distant lands, a place where even the darkest shadows hesitated to tread. Yet, Túrin felt no comfort. The curse that followed him had proven relentless, and he wondered how long this fragile peace could last. Thingol's halls were carved into the living stone, a marvel of elven craftsmanship that seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of the earth itself. Túrin stood before the elven king, his head held high. His black hair fell over his shoulders, and his gaze met Thingol's with an intensity that bordered on defiance. There was no place for submission in Túrin's heart, not even here. "I come seeking refuge," he said, his voice steady but low. "I have no illusions of peace, but I offer my strength in defense of your realm." Thingol studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. The king of Doriath was a figure of great power, yet there was a wisdom in his gaze that seemed to see through to the very soul. "You carry the weight of a heavy fate, son of Túrin," Thingol said at last. "Doriath has its own share of burdens. But if you will fight to protect this land, then you are welcome." The alliance between Túrin and Thingol was not forged in trust but necessity. The forest whispered of a great threat, a shadow that moved at the edges of the world. Morgoth's forces were gathering, their eyes now fixed on Doriath. Túrin, with his unmatched skill in battle, became a crucial part of the defense. The elves, wary of his fiery temper and the curse that followed him, watched from a distance, their doubts hidden behind polite words. The first assault came in the dead of night. A hush fell over the forest as if the trees themselves held their breath. Then, like a storm breaking, the clash of steel and the roars of orcs shattered the silence. Túrin was at the forefront, his blade flashing like a shard of the night sky. The black sword, reforged and unyielding, moved with a deadly grace in his hands. Each swing was precise, each blow a defiance of the darkness that sought to consume everything. The elves fought alongside him, their arrows slicing through the air with a deadly accuracy. Thingol's warriors were swift and agile, their movements like a dance, but even they could not match the raw fury that Túrin unleashed. He fought as if possessed, his strikes fueled by more than just the need to survive. It was anger, grief, and something deeper, a desperate refusal to let the curse dictate his every step. As dawn broke, the ground was littered with the bodies of the fallen. The air was thick with the scent of blood and the acrid smoke of battle. Túrin stood amidst the carnage, his chest heaving. The victory was hard-won, but it was a victory nonetheless. Yet, as he wiped the blood from his sword, a shadow of unease flickered in his eyes. He knew this was only the beginning. The days that followed were tense. Scouts brought word of larger forces moving toward Doriath. Morgoth's wrath was unrelenting, and his agents worked tirelessly to spread fear and division. Túrin walked the halls of Thingol's court, his presence a storm waiting to break. Though he had proven himself in battle, whispers followed him like ghosts. Some saw him as a savior, others as a harbinger of doom. Ninor's absence weighed heavily on Túrin's heart. She had remained behind, her fragile state unable to endure the trials of war. At night, when the fires burned low and the forest hummed with an eerie quiet, Túrin would sit alone, his thoughts drifting to her. He wondered if she was safe, if the curse had spared her its cruel grasp. The longing to see her again was a pain sharper than any wound he had endured. Another assault came, this one more ferocious than the last. Morgoth's forces moved like a tide, relentless and overwhelming. Among them were creatures of nightmare, beasts twisted by dark sorcery, their roars echoing through the trees. Túrin led the charge, his voice rising above the chaos as he rallied the defenders. His presence was a beacon, a symbol of unyielding resistance, even as the odds turned against them. The battle raged for hours, the forest trembling under the weight of the conflict. Túrin fought with a desperation that bordered on recklessness, his every movement a testament to his indomitable will. When the final blow was struck and the last of Morgoth's forces fled into the shadows, Doriath stood, battered but unbroken. Thingol approached Túrin as the fires of the battlefield began to die down. The Elven King's expression was somber, his gaze heavy with the burden of what had been lost. "You have given much to this fight, Túrin," he said. "But the war is far from over. Morgoth will not rest until all the light in this world is extinguished. Turin nodded, his jaw set. Then neither will I. But even as the words left his lips, a flicker of doubt stirred within him. The curse was a shadow he could not escape, its tendrils weaving through every victory, every moment of respite. He had seen its effects too often, felt its grip tighten with each step he took. How long could he fight against a fate that seemed as inevitable as the rising of the sun? The forest was quiet that night, the air heavy with the scent of rain. Turin stood at the edge of a clearing, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The stars above seemed impossibly distant, their light cold and unfeeling. He clenched his fists, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. The road ahead was dark, its end shrouded in uncertainty. But there was no turning back. The fire crackled low in the dim cave where Turin had sought a brief refuge. Shadows danced across the rough stone walls, shifting like restless spirits in the night. Sleep eluded him once more, and as he stared into the flickering flames, his mind churned with 1,000 unspoken fears. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it whispers that felt almost alive. It began subtly, as it always did. A fleeting thought that wasn't quite his own, a voice threading through his mind like a needle through cloth. At first, he ignored it, dismissing it as weariness or the aftershock of countless battles. But the voice persisted, growing stronger, its tone insidious and serpentine. "You fight for a cause that will betray you," it murmured. "How many have you saved, Turin? How many lives lie broken in your wake?" His jaw clenched as he rose abruptly, pacing the length of the cave. He told himself it was nothing, just an echo of his guilt and anger. Yet, the voice twisted deeper, coiling around his thoughts like a snake. "They whisper your name with fear, not reverence. The curse that clings to you is stronger than any blade. Even now, it tightens its hold." Turin froze, his breath catching in his throat. The firelight glinted off his sword, lying against the wall, its dark steel gleaming like an eye watching him. He knew who it was, or rather, what it was. Morgoth. The Dark Lord's power reached far beyond the lands of Angband, seeping into the minds of those he sought to claim. This was no ordinary whisper, it was a carefully crafted poison, designed to break him. "No," Turin growled, his voice firm though his hands trembled. "You cannot sway me." The laughter that followed was chilling, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. It echoed in his ears, mocking and cruel. "Cannot sway you? But I already have. Every choice you make serves my design. Every victory you claim furthers the curse I laid upon your house. Deny it all you wish, but your fate is sealed." Turin clenched his fists, his nails biting into his palms. Memories flooded his mind, of his family, torn apart by grief and war, of friends and allies, lost to the unrelenting tide of darkness, of Ninor, her face both a comfort and a torment. The weight of it threatened to crush him, but he fought against it with all his might. "Your words are nothing but lies," he spat, his voice rising above the storm outside. "I have forged my path with my own hands. Whatever curse you think binds me, I will break it." The voice fell silent for a moment, and Turin almost believed he had driven it away. But then it returned, softer now, almost tender. "Is that what you tell yourself? That you can escape the destiny I have woven for you? You are strong, Turin, but not strong enough. Look around you. Even now, you stand alone. The ones you love are gone, scattered like leaves in the wind. What do you truly fight for?" His knees buckled as a wave of exhaustion crashed over him, but he caught himself, leaning heavily against the wall. His breathing was ragged, his chest tight. The doubts Morgoth sowed began to root themselves in his heart. What was he fighting for? Each step forward seemed only to lead to more pain, more loss. Was he doomed to wander forever, cursed to destroy everything he touched? As if in answer, the flames of the fire surged suddenly, casting grotesque shadows across the cave. The voice returned, this time accompanied by visions, his mother, Morwen, standing alone in the ruins of their home, her eyes hollow with despair. Ninor, wandering aimlessly, her hands clutching at nothing, her face a mask of confusion and sorrow. Allies slain, their blood staining the ground where they had stood beside him. The scenes played out like a nightmare, each one more vivid than the last. "See the truth," Morgoth whispered. "You cannot escape it." Turin fell to his knees, his head in his hands. The images tore at him, unraveling his resolve. But then, amidst the chaos, a memory surfaced of his father, Hurin, standing tall and defiant before Morgoth himself, refusing to bow even as the Dark Lord cursed him. The thought sparked something within Turin, a flicker of light in the overwhelming darkness. "You are wrong," he said, his voice shaking but resolute. "I may have suffered, but I will not break. My father stood against you, and so will I." The laughter returned, but it no longer held the same power. Turin rose to his feet, his grip tightening around the hilt of his sword. The flames dimmed as the visions faded, leaving only the sound of the wind and his own heartbeat. The voice had retreated, but its presence lingered like a shadow at the edge of his mind. He stepped out of the cave, the cold night air biting at his skin. The stars above were veiled by thick clouds, but he didn't need their light to guide him. The path before him was uncertain, fraught with peril and pain, but it was his to walk. Morgoth could whisper his lies and weave his traps, but Turin would meet them head-on. As he moved forward, the weight of Morgoth's manipulations hung heavy on him, but it was a burden he carried with defiance. Each step echoed with determination, a silent vow to uncover the truth and to defy the darkness that sought to consume him. The storm in his heart raged on, but amidst it, there was a spark, a reminder that even in the blackest night, there was the possibility of dawn. The wind carried a biting chill as Turin stood at the edge of a vast, shadowed valley. Far in the distance, beyond the haze of despair and the jagged peaks of unyielding stone, loomed Angband, the fortress of darkness, Morgoth's stronghold. It pulsed with a malevolence that seemed to warp the very air around it. Here, the weight of the curse felt heavier than ever, an oppressive force pressing down on his chest. Turin's resolve burned fiercely, though every step toward that place felt like wading deeper into a mire of doom. He wasn't here for vengeance, nor for glory. This was something far greater, an attempt to unravel the very threads of Morgoth's curse that had bound his family in misery. The way forward was treacherous, and doubt clawed at the edges of his mind. Yet, he pushed onward, his heart a tumult of defiance and desperation. The path grew darker as he moved, the ground beneath his feet shifting from firm earth to jagged rock. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, as if reaching for him, and the air thickened, tasting of ash and decay. It was not long before he encountered the first of the ancient beings who would cross his path. From the darkness emerged a figure cloaked in robes that seemed woven from the night itself. Its face was obscured, but the voice that spoke was neither kind nor cruel. It echoed with an ancient weariness, the voice of something that had witnessed ages beyond comprehension. "You seek to unmake a curse bound by hatred older than the world," it said, its tone measured, like a tolling bell. "What makes you believe you have the strength?" Turin's grip tightened on his sword, his voice steady despite the dread that coiled in his chest. "Because I must. Because if I do not, this curse will destroy all that remains of my kin." The figure seemed to steady him, though its eyes were hidden. "Strength of will may carry you far, but it is not enough. To unbind what Morgoth has wrought is to challenge the very essence of his malice. You will face trials that will strip you bare, leaving only truth. Are you prepared for that?" Turin's jaw clenched, but he nodded. "Let him throw his worst at me. I will endure." The figure tilted its head, as if in quiet approval or pity. It reached out a hand, and a faint light shimmered briefly in the gloom. Then it was gone, leaving Turin to face the silence once more. The cryptic encounter only deepened his unease, but it also kindled a small spark of determination. He pressed forward. The terrain grew harsher, the air colder. He passed through a dead forest, where the trees stood like charred sentinels, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky. The whispers began here, soft at first but growing louder with each step. They spoke of his failures, of the loved ones he had lost, of the blood on his hands. The voice of Morgoth slithered through them, taunting and cruel. "Turn back," it hissed. "This path will bring nothing but ruin. You cannot undo what I have done. You are mine, Turin. Always." He stumbled but did not fall. The doubt surged, threatening to drown him, but he kept walking. Through the whispers, another voice surfaced, a memory of Ninor, her laugh, her smile. It was fleeting but enough to anchor him. He clenched his fists and shouted into the void, "You will not break me." The whispers faltered, though they did not vanish. Still, they seemed less potent, their edges dulled by his defiance. As he climbed higher into the mountains surrounding Angband, another figure appeared, a great beast with eyes like molten gold and scales that shimmered with a dark iridescence. Its voice rumbled like distant thunder. "You tread on the edge of destruction," it growled. "To challenge the Dark One is folly. Turn back now, while you still breathe." Turin raised his sword, though he knew it would do little against such a creature. "I will not turn back," he said. "If destruction is the price of ending this curse, so be it." The beast's laughter was low and rumbling. "Bold words. But boldness is not wisdom. Morgoth's power is absolute, his will unyielding. To oppose him is to invite annihilation." "Then let him try," Turin replied, his voice like steel. "I will meet him with all that I am." The beast regarded him for a long moment before stepping aside, its golden eyes gleaming with something akin to respect, or perhaps curiosity. "Go, then, child of men. Face your fate." Turin passed without looking back. The path grew steeper, the air thinner. Every step was a test of endurance, each breath a battle. Yet, as he climbed, he felt a strange clarity settle over him. The encounters, the whispers, even the oppressive weight of the curse, they were all part of something greater. Morgoth sought to break him, but each trial only strengthened his resolve. The entrance to Angband loomed before him, a yawning maw of darkness that seemed to swallow the very light around it. The air here was suffocating, thick with the stench of sulfur and despair. He paused, staring into the abyss, his heart pounding. Turin took a deep breath, steadying himself. His hand tightened around his sword hilt, and he stepped forward, swallowed by the shadows of Angband. In the oppressive silence, his mind raced with what lay ahead, each step pulling him closer to the heart of the darkness, where the curse itself awaited. And in that silence, Morgoth waited too. The wind howled across the desolate plain before Angband, carrying the scent of ash and despair. Turin stood on the brink of an impossible battle, his heart as heavy as the sword he bore. The land stretched before him, scarred and blackened by ages of torment under Morgoth's shadow. Yet within him burned a defiant fire, a fierce hope kindled by the sheer need to rise above despair. He was no stranger to pain or loss, but this moment felt like the culmination of everything he had endured, a chance to strike at the darkness that had haunted him since his first breath. As he prepared for what felt like a solitary struggle, a figure emerged from the mist. Cloaked in light that seemed to push back the pervasive gloom, the being approached with an air of serene power. Turin's grip on his sword tightened instinctively, but the figure raised a hand, and an overwhelming sense of peace washed over him. "You carry a heavy burden, son of Hurin," the figure said, its voice melodic yet firm, resonating in a way that felt like the world itself was speaking. "But even the darkest shadow fears the light. I am here to help." Turin's eyes narrowed, suspicion mingling with the faintest glimmer of hope. "Who are you?" he demanded. "I am a servant of the light," the figure replied, stepping closer. As the mist parted, Turin could see that this was no ordinary ally. The Maya's form shimmered, an ethereal glow surrounding them. "Morgoth may be mighty, but he is not invincible. Together, we can make him tremble." For the first time in what felt like years, Turin felt the icy grip of isolation begin to thaw. The Maya's presence was a balm to his weary soul, and their words were not empty promises. They carried the weight of ancient wisdom and unyielding resolve. "We will need more than words to bring him down," Turin said, his voice edged with the grit of countless battles fought and lost. "And we shall have more than words," the Maya replied. They extended a hand toward the horizon, and a radiant light burst forth, illuminating the land. Out of the shadows came figures, elves, men, and dwarves, each bearing arms and armor. They moved with a unity and determination that Turin had seldom witnessed. These were not soldiers conscripted into battle, they were individuals bound by a shared purpose, to stand against the darkness that had plagued their world for too long. Turin's heart surged with something unfamiliar, hope. For so long, he had fought alone, his battles waged in the shadows against foes who seemed insurmountable. Now, he saw the beginnings of a force that could challenge even the might of Angband. The Maya turned to him, their gaze piercing yet kind. "You have carried the sword of vengeance long enough, Turin. Let it now become the sword of hope. Lead them." The weight of the words settled heavily on Turin's shoulders. He had never sought leadership, he had only ever sought to survive, to fight, to endure. But looking at the faces of those who had come to stand with him, he felt a surge of purpose unlike anything he had known. They weren't following him out of obligation, they believed in him. The days that followed were a blur of preparation. Plans were drawn, strategies discussed. The Maya's knowledge of Morgoth's forces proved invaluable, as did Turin's understanding of warfare and the enemy's cunning. Slowly, they forged an army that was more than just a collection of warriors, it was a symbol of defiance, a beacon of hope for a world shrouded in despair. On the eve of the battle, Turin stood alone, gazing out at the vast expanse of Angband. The fortress loomed like a blight on the land, its dark towers reaching for the sky as if to tear it down. His thoughts turned to his family, Morwen, Ninor, and his father, Hurin. He carried their pain with him, their suffering a constant reminder of the stakes. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, the army assembled. The sight was breathtaking, rows upon rows of warriors, their armor glinting in the early sun, their banners fluttering in the wind. The Maya stood at the forefront, their light a rallying point for all who had gathered. Turin took his place beside them, the black sword gleaming in his hand. When the signal was given, the army advanced. The ground trembled beneath their march, and the air crackled with anticipation. As they neared Angband, the gates of the fortress groaned open, and Morgoth's forces poured forth. Orcs, trolls, and other creatures of nightmare spilled onto the battlefield, their cries echoing like thunder. Above them flew dark-winged beasts, their shadows blotting out the sun. The clash was deafening, a cacophony of steel and cries that shook the earth. Turin fought with a ferocity that seemed almost otherworldly, his blade cutting through the enemy like a shard of midnight itself. He was a force of nature, his movements precise and unrelenting. Around him, his allies held their ground, their unity a stark contrast to the chaos of Morgoth's horde. The Maya was a beacon on the battlefield, their presence bolstering the spirits of those who fought. They wielded powers that seemed to defy the very laws of nature, casting down foes with waves of light and fire. Beside them, Turin felt the weight of his curse lighten, if only for a moment. Together, they were an unstoppable force, carving a path through the enemy ranks. But the battle was far from over. From the depths of Angband came Morgoth's most fearsome creations, Balrogs wreathed in flame, their whips lashing through the air with deadly precision. One of them set its sights on Turin, its molten eyes locking onto him with a malevolent hunger. The ground shook as it advanced, each step a testament to its terrible power. Turin faced the Balrog with a steely resolve, his grip on the black sword unyielding. The clash between them was titanic, a meeting of raw power and unbreakable will. Sparks flew as their weapons met, the air around them crackling with energy. The Balrog roared, its fiery whip striking out, but Turin moved with the precision of a seasoned warrior, evading and countering with devastating blows. The battle raged on, the tide ebbing and flowing with each moment. The Maya and Turin fought side by side, their combined strength a rallying point for the army. Slowly but surely, they began to push the enemy back, their hope burning brighter with each victory. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the battlefield in a crimson glow, Turin raised his sword high, its black blade gleaming with the blood of Morgoth's minions. The sight was a rallying cry, a symbol of defiance against the darkness. Though the battle was far from over, the tide had shifted, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, hope shone brightly against the shadow of Angband. The ground beneath Turin's feet trembled, as though the earth itself were holding its breath. Angband, Morgoth's towering fortress, loomed ahead, its gates a jagged maw in the side of a mountain, ready to devour anything that dared approach. The air was thick with the stench of sulfur and smoke, the horizon burning with the scarlet hue of a dying sun. For all his years of battle, all his loss, pain, and suffering, nothing had prepared him for the weight of what he was about to face. His hand gripped the hilt of his sword, the black sword, the weapon forged with such hope and vengeance, now a symbol of everything he had lost and everything he had become. He had fought so long, endured so much, only to find himself standing at the very gates of hell. But this was it. There could be no turning back now. The final battle was before him, and the stakes were higher than ever. As the army of light gathered, ready to assault the fortress, Turin felt a strange stillness settle over him. The clang of armor, the pounding of war drums, and the cries of his comrades faded into a distant hum. All that mattered now was this moment. This confrontation. His thoughts drifted to his father, his family, and all those who had suffered because of Morgoth's evil. They were with him now, urging him forward. He could feel their spirits in the air, like an unspoken prayer. Then, as the gates of Angband began to groan open, a darkness like none he had ever known seeped from within. It wasn't just the presence of Morgoth, no, it was something more insidious. A shadow that clouded his mind and made his very soul tremble. The doors of Angband opened fully, and through them, a figure emerged. Sauron. Turin's blood ran cold. Sauron, the Dark Lieutenant of Morgoth, the one who had twisted so many into servitude. He stood there, towering above them all, a figure of malevolent power, his very form a distortion of what should have been. His eyes gleamed with the malice of ages, his laughter echoing in the air as if mocking every hope, every shred of courage that had led Turin and his allies here. "You've come so far," Sauron's voice rumbled, deep and mocking. "But all your efforts, all your sacrifice, are meaningless. Morgoth's will is unbreakable. You are nothing but pawns in his game." Turin's grip on his sword tightened, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The battle within him was more than just a fight for survival. It was a fight for his very soul. He could feel the weight of his curse, the curse of his family, pressing down on him like a heavy stone. And yet, amid the crushing darkness, a flicker of defiance remained. A spark of light that refused to be extinguished. "You're wrong," Turin said, his voice low but firm. "We are not pawns. We are the ones who will bring an end to your master's reign." "This is where it ends, Sauron." The words seemed to hang in the air for a moment, carrying more power than anything Turin had spoken before. The world seemed to pause, as if waiting for the clash of titanic forces that was about to unfold. Sauron's lips twisted into a cruel smile. "You think you can defy me? You think you can defy the Dark Lord? You are nothing. A mere mortal, doomed from the start. And yet, you persist. You fight against your fate, against the darkness that courses through your veins." Turin didn't respond. He didn't need to. The sword in his hand, the black sword, pulsed with an ancient power of its own. It had been with him through every trial, every battle, and every moment of pain. It had been the one constant in his life. Now, as he raised it high, it seemed to hum with a life of its own, a promise that he was not alone, that he was not powerless. The battle began with a deafening roar. Sauron's dark magic surged forward, crashing into the light like a tidal wave. The very air seemed to warp, bending with the weight of the curse that had bound Turin's fate for so long. Shadows stretched out from Sauron, wrapping themselves around him like chains, whispering threats of doom. But Turin didn't flinch. He stepped forward, his sword slicing through the dark tendrils that reached for him. Every swing was more than just an attack, it was an expression of everything he had fought for, everything he had endured. The black sword cut through Sauron's illusions like they were nothing but smoke. With each strike, Turin could feel the curse that had bound him for so long beginning to unravel, bit by bit. Sauron's form flickered, and for a moment, it seemed like Túrin was no longer facing a man, but a monstrous shadow, a thing not bound by flesh or bone, but by pure malice. The air grew thick with despair, and Túrin's body screamed for rest. But still, he fought on, fueled by something deeper than rage, deeper than vengeance. It was the hope that had carried him here, the love of his family, the bonds he had forged with those who stood beside him. With a final, shattering blow, Túrin struck at Sauron. The ground trembled as the dark figure screeched, the force of the strike breaking through the illusions and shadows that surrounded him. For a moment, there was silence. Then, like the fading of a storm, Sauron's form crumbled, dissolving into nothingness. But as Sauron fell, the very air seemed to crack, and Túrin felt it, an enormous weight pressing down on him, a force that sought to crush him, to extinguish the light that had just begun to grow within him. Morgoth's wrath surged from the depths of Angband, a final attempt to smother the hope that had kindled in Túrin's heart. The gates of Angband groaned once more, as though the fortress itself were alive, aware of its imminent defeat. The battle was not over. It had only just begun. Túrin stood alone for a moment, his chest heaving, sweat dripping from his brow. His heart pounded in his chest like a drum, and for the first time in years, he felt a deep, quiet sense of peace. He had faced Sauron, and he had won. But there was still Morgoth to confront. Still the curse to break. Still the long road ahead. The black sword in his hand felt lighter now, its weight not just one of steel, but of everything that had come before. With one final glance at the shattered remnants of Sauron, Túrin prepared for the next battle, the one that would decide the fate of Middle-earth itself. The earth beneath Túrin's feet trembled with a foreboding rumble as he stood before the Dark Lord himself, Morgoth. The towering form of the ancient enemy filled the sky, his very presence warping the air with malice. Shadows clung to him, like living things, and his eyes gleamed with a cruel, otherworldly light. Morgoth stood there, a towering monument of hate, his dark power exuding like the poison from an ancient wound that refused to heal. Túrin had been here before, in the depths of his heart, fighting the curses and shadows that had followed him for as long as he could remember. But now, this was the moment. This was where everything came together, every battle, every loss, every sacrifice. This was where he would end it all. One last stand to break the chains that had bound his family, his soul, for far too long. And yet, a strange calm settled over him as he stared up at the looming figure. Morgoth had done everything in his power to destroy him, to destroy his family. Every victory had been stolen, every hope dashed. The curse had marked him, shaped him, turned him into a figure of vengeance and darkness. But now, standing at the precipice of the final battle, Túrin knew this was the end. The end of the curse. The end of Morgoth's reign of terror. Morgoth's voice echoed like thunder, reverberating through the air, shaking the very ground beneath them. So, you have come to die. Do you think your death will break the chains that bind you? Do you think your sacrifice will matter in the grand scheme of things? You are nothing, Túrin. Just like the rest of your family. Just like all those who came before you. Túrin gritted his teeth, every word of Morgoth's curse sinking into his heart like a poisoned blade. But he would not be moved. He would not let his own despair take hold now, not when victory was so close. His hand clenched around the hilt of the black sword, the weapon that had become both his burden and his salvation. He could feel the weight of it, the weight of everything it represented. All the lives lost. All the pain endured. All the hope that had been dashed, only to rise again. I am not your pawn anymore, Túrin said, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. I am not the one you control. I am not the son of your hatred. I am the one who will end you. With a roar, Morgoth surged forward, his enormous form descending upon Túrin like a wave of dark energy. The clash between them was thunderous, a battle between the light of hope and the crushing weight of evil. Every strike from Morgoth was like the pounding of a hammer against stone. Every swing of Túrin's sword felt like a prayer for those he loved, for all the fallen, for his family, and for a future free of the curse that had marked them all. The battle waged on, the sky itself seeming to split in two with the force of their clash. Turin could feel his strength waning, his body growing heavier with each blow. The sword felt like it was made of lead, the weight of all his burdens bearing down upon him. But still, he fought. Still, he held on to the last thread of his humanity. For hours, it seemed, they battled. Morgoth rained down blow after blow, the very earth shuddering beneath the weight of his power. Turin's breath came in ragged gasps, each one harder than the last. His muscles burned, his vision blurred. But he would not stop. He could not stop. Finally, in a moment of sheer defiance, Turin raised the black sword high and plunged it into the heart of the Dark Lord. The sword, once a symbol of torment, now became the tool of salvation. Morgoth's scream pierced the very fabric of the world, a shrill wail of agony that reverberated through the heavens. The ground beneath them cracked open, and for a moment, everything seemed to stand still. Then, as if by some miracle, Morgoth's form began to crumble, his power fading, unraveling, like a broken thread. The sky, once blackened with the weight of his shadow, lightened, the first rays of dawn breaking through the storm clouds. The curse, the dark weight that had bound Turin's soul for so long, shattered with the fall of Morgoth. But the cost was immeasurable. Turin, his body battered, his soul weary, could feel the life slipping from him. His breath became slower, each exhale more labored than the last. His heart, so long driven by anger and revenge, now beat with a different rhythm, a rhythm of peace, of finality. "I've broken it," he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible. "It's over." But even as Morgoth fell, the price of victory was clear. Turin's vision began to fade, the light of the world growing dimmer with each passing second. He could feel the weight of his body pulling him down, the last threads of life slipping through his fingers like sand. His eyes, once full of fire and fury, now held only a quiet acceptance. He had done it. He had broken the curse. He had freed his family. But at what cost? In his final moments, Turin thought of his mother, of his sister, of all the lives that had been affected by the evil that had plagued their family for so long. He thought of his comrades, the people who had stood by him through every battle, every trial. He thought of the hope that had burned in him even when everything seemed lost. And he thought of the peace that now lay before him. And then, as his body gave way to the inevitable, Turin felt it, the weight of his sacrifice. The darkness that had clung to him for so long, the curse that had followed him like a shadow, was gone. His soul was free. And in that freedom, there was a quiet, aching joy. He had paid the price. But at least, at last, he was free. The world was silent for a moment. As the last echoes of Morgoth's scream faded into the wind, a heavy stillness descended upon the lands. The earth seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, the oppressive weight of darkness lifting for the first time in ages. The sun, once obscured by the shadow of evil, slowly began to rise, casting golden light across a world that had long forgotten the feel of warmth. But that peace, though hard won, came at a cost. Turin was gone. The hero who had borne the weight of so many lives, so much suffering, and so many shattered dreams had laid down his sword and his life. His final breath had come in the very moment when victory seemed within grasp, when the darkness had been torn asunder. The world, freed from Morgoth's tyranny, now had to carry on without him. The battle was over, but the scars of the fight would remain forever. The people of Middle-earth, those who had once been caged in fear and despair, now found themselves walking in the light. The shadows that had darkened their hearts for so long were finally gone, replaced with a fragile sense of hope. Morgoth's reign of terror had ended, and the chains that had bound the lands were broken. But even as the sun rose, there was no true joy, no loud celebration. The victory, so hard-earned, was stained with the bitter truth of what had been sacrificed. In the quiet aftermath, the bards began their work. They sang of Turin, of the man who had fought against impossible odds, who had carried the weight of an entire world on his shoulders. His name would be etched into the hearts of the people forever, his story passed down through the generations, told and retold in songs and stories. His legacy would live on, a reminder of both the terrible cost of war and the light that still remained after the darkness had been driven away. But even as his name was sung in praises, there was no true relief in the hearts of those who remembered. His story was one of tragedy, of a soul marked by a curse, of a man who had given everything, yet had never known peace. And though the world was free from the shadows of Morgoth, the scars of the past lingered like ghosts, unable to be erased. The families who had lost so much, the warriors who had fought beside him, the children who had grown up in a world of war, they could not simply forget the price that had been paid. Still, there was hope. It wasn't a bright, blinding hope, but a quiet, steady flicker that refused to die. A glimmer of light in a world that had known too much darkness. The healing had begun, though it would take time. The lands would mend, the trees would regrow, and the hearts of the people would slowly find peace again. It would not be quick, and it would not be easy. But it would happen. The ruins of Morgoth's fortress, once a symbol of utter despair, now stood as a monument to the strength of those who had defied him. The armies of the free peoples of Middle-earth had scattered, but their courage had not been in vain. They had won. They had endured. They had brought an end to the nightmare that had haunted them all for so long. But for Túrin, there would be no resurrection, no return to the world he had saved. His death, so entwined with the curse that had followed him, was not a peaceful one. It had been a final act of defiance, a breaking of chains that had bound him and his people. His name would echo through the ages, but the man himself would never walk among the living again. And yet, as the seasons turned and time moved on, something began to change. A soft wind blew across the land, carrying with it the whispers of new beginnings. The people of Middle-earth, though still scarred, began to rebuild. They looked to the future with a quiet resilience, knowing that the darkness had not won in the end. Morgoth was gone. The curse was broken. And though Túrin had not lived to see the world freed, his sacrifice had made it possible. There was a sense of peace in the land, but it was fragile, like the first fragile shoots of spring after a harsh winter. It would grow stronger, it would spread, but it had to be nurtured. The legacy of Túrin, of his sacrifice and his strength, was the seed from which the new world would grow. His name would never fade from memory, not for those who had known him, not for those who had fought with him, and not for the generations who would hear his tale sung in their ears. The bards sang of his courage, of his unwavering determination to fight for a better world, even when it seemed like the world was against him. They sang of the great battles, the victories, the moments of triumph. But they also sang of his pain, of the loneliness that had followed him, of the burden he had borne all his life. They sang of the man who had never known true happiness, but had still given everything for others. And as they sang, the world began to heal. Not quickly, not perfectly, but the wounds of Middle-earth began to close. The people who had once been divided by fear and hatred began to work together, rebuilding their homes, their families, their communities. The memory of Morgoth's shadow slowly faded, replaced by the brighter light of hope. It was not a perfect peace, but it was a peace that could grow. A peace that could endure. And through it all, Túrin's name lived on. Not just in the songs sung by the bards, but in the hearts of all who had witnessed the fall of Morgoth, the liberation of Middle-earth. His legacy was one of sacrifice, of defiance against impossible odds, of a love for his people that had driven him to the edge of his own soul. His name would never fade from the pages of history, for in his story, there was both the heartbreak of loss and the glimmer of hope that would last long after the shadows had gone.